If you look just at the history we've discussed, Russia promised in writing that it would respect the territorial integrity and existing borders of Ukraine in the Budapest Memorandum and subsequently. So, I mean, frankly, you would be forgiven for thinking that those promises aren't worth the paper that they're written on if they're not backed up by some real power on the ground.
Now, this week could be pivotal for the future of Ukraine, with the US Special Envoy for Peace, Steve Witkoff, due to visit Russia with the aim of negotiating an end to the war in Ukraine. It should be said that the Wall Street Journal has published an article saying the main motivation for Donald Trump and Witkoff is to make money out of the peace process, not to deliver justice. But there is a revised 19-point plan taking shape with the aid of European allies, including the UK, which seeks to increase security guarantees to Ukraine. But with negotiations between Russia and Ukraine over Russia and Ukraine having taken place over decades, we thought we'd open up the archive on those negotiations and deals which perhaps have paved the way to where we are today. And delighted to say that joining us is Jeffrey Price. He is a former US Department of Defense negotiator with Ukraine and Russia and was involved in the Bucharest Memorandum and various nuclear deals with both parties. Hello to you, Jeffrey Price.
Thanks for having me.
I mean, when we were discussing what we should put in the archive, you wanted to start with the Helsinki Conference in 1975, a major conference, of course, before the end of the USSR or the Warsaw Pact, involving 35 nations. Why was that so significant?
Well, that was something that was started really at the initiative of the Soviet bloc, and they wanted to lock in some of the territorial boundaries after World War II. And in part, sort of in exchange for that, they agreed to other principles such as the freedom of nations to determine their own alliances, human rights, basic sort of sovereignty, and in theory, democratic values. Now, that was a bit rich during the Cold War, but after the Cold War, those were reaffirmed, and those very principles were reaffirmed very specifically with regard to Ukraine in 1994 in the Budapest Memorandum, which was part of the arrangements under which Ukraine gave up what was then the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. So those principles are principles that the Soviets, that everybody in Europe and North America signed up to, and everybody continues to reaffirm that they're valid. The problem is that Russia is right now flagrantly violating them.
Well, let's skip to that very important agreement, the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, which formally saw the US, Russia and the UK agreeing to provide security assurances to Ukraine, Belarus and Kazakhstan on their accession to the Treaty on Non-Proliferation. In other words, guarantees if they gave up their nuclear weapons, as they did. Let's listen to the signing ceremony.
The presidents of the Russian Federation, Ukraine, and the United States of America, and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom will now sign the Memorandum on Security Assurances for Ukraine. President Kuchma will provide the Presidents of Russian Federation and the United States of America and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom with Ukraine's instrument of accession to the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
And here's what President Clinton said at that event.
Skeptics once claimed that the nuclear threat would actually grow after the Soviet Union dissolved. But because of the wisdom and statesmanship of the leaders who joined me here, the skeptics have been proven wrong.
And, of course, the host in Budapest was the Hungarian president at the time, Arpad Goncs. And he reflected on the significance of the decision for Ukraine.
The significance of this summit will be even higher by the fact that Ukraine will present it through its instrument of accession to the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons to the leaders of the three depository states. It is needless to say how much importance we all attach to the decision taken by the Ukrainian parliament which paved the way to the full membership of Ukraine to the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state. We know that the considerations that have led Ukraine to this step were complex and comprehensive in terms of the basic security needs of this country.
But Jeffrey, there then followed a NATO conference, which you were involved in, not in Budapest, but in Bucharest, in Romania, where it seemed that there were quite strong limits, certainly from the Western point of view, as to what guarantees they were preferred to honour towards Ukraine. Would that be fair?
Yeah, so I didn't play a direct role in Bucharest, but I do remember that. I mean, the issue always looming in the background was you've regularized the architecture of security in Europe at a basic level. You've decided that the end of the Cold War is not going to lead to more nuclear powers. So Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, which had Soviet nuclear arsenal on them, agreed to join the non-proliferation regime as non-nuclear weapon states. But there was always the question of other countries joining NATO, starting with Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic in 1997. And inevitably, the issue would arise whether Ukraine or Georgia would be allowed to join. And what happened in Bucharest in 2008 was a bit of a diplomatic standoff where the President Bush wanted to extend what's called a membership action plan, sort of set a path that would start Ukraine and Georgia on the road to membership, and there was resistance to that. So wisely or unwisely, what NATO said was, instead of giving them a path to membership, we're simply going to declare that Ukraine and Georgia will eventually become members. And this, in my view, was kind of the wrong answer, because it said what would be provocative to Putin without creating the realities on the ground that would ease the path towards integration into NATO for Ukraine.
And of course, within months, there were Russian troops into Georgia, and then in 2013, as the Maidan protests were underway in Ukraine for democracy, in response to President Yanukovych's decision not to sign a free trade agreement with the EU, rather than opting for closer relations with Russia, there were violent protests as hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets across the country, with the government actually opening up fire on the protesters. Here is a then leader of the opposition, Vitaly Klitschko, speaking.
Just coming from discussion with the president, we have to stop all escalation. It's our main goal, and I told the president right now he has stopped to cleaning Maidan, because it's every minute died people. And just one way to stop that and to continue negotiation tomorrow.
And the president at the time, who was being protested against, Viktor Yanukovych, accused the opposition of inciting a coup.
The opposition leaders have ignored the basic foundation of democracy. Power is gained not on streets or maidans, but in electoral districts. The line has been crossed when they called people to arms. This is a grave breaking of the law. The lawbreakers must stand trial before the court that will determine their level of guilt.
But as Ukraine turned towards the west, following the power vacuum of the Euromaidan revolution, Russia retaliated by invading the Crimean Peninsula, which had been ceded to Ukraine by President Khrushchev, and annexed it. They installed a pro-Russian government led by Sergei Aksyonov and held a referendum under Russian control, which reported majority support for joining Russia. Here's Vladimir Putin speaking in the aftermath.
Today, the hysterics need to stop, and the Cold War rhetorics need to be rejected. Russia is an independent, active participator in the international scheme. Like other countries, it has international interests that should be considered and respected. I address the people of Ukraine. I would sincerely like you to understand us. By no means do we want to do you harm, offend your sense of nationality. We have always respected the territorial integrity of the Ukrainian power. Crimea is our most common possession, And the most important factor in the region's stability and this strategic territory must be under a strong, stable sovereignty, and that is today could only be Russia. The referendum was conducted openly and fairly, and the people in Crimea expressed their will clearly and earnestly. They want to be with Russia. Today, based on the results of the referendum in Crimea, relying on the people's will, I submit to the Federal Council and request to consider a constitutional law to accept two new federal subjects to Russia, the Crimean Republic and Sevastopol City.
And of course, alongside grabbing Crimea, Russia was also infiltrating so-called little green men into the Donbas, into eastern Ukraine, fomenting conflict there. And Geoffrey Price, at this time in 2015, there was then something called the Minsk agreements, which were reached. What was the significance of those?
I mean, this was an attempt, it was a European-led attempt to kind of broker a peace of sorts in the Donbas. The problem was that from Ukraine's perspective, it was giving up a lot of sovereignty, a lot of control of its territory. And frankly, in my view, Russia wanted to use its position, which was basically proxy. There was Russian intelligence assets. This was not an entirely indigenous insurgency in the Donbas. They were trying to use this as a means of controlling Ukraine and preventing Ukraine from having a free hand in its future. I mean, I think at the bottom, it's been a tug of war, Russia wanting to dominate Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, along with their government, very much resisting that. I mean, the thing that I find really interesting is not just in the Orange Revolution, but in the Euro Maidan, it was the Ukrainian people who stood up to their government and said, no, we, in this case, want to be a Western European country. We want to go in a direction that the government is not letting us go to. So you have the seeds of kind of a vibrant democracy among the people in Ukraine, something that's sort of very different from what they're looking at if they're under a Russian-dominated system.
And of course, in February 2022, Russia did engage in a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and that has led to the 3 years of conflict we've seen since then. Now we've got a US presidential envoy, Steve Witkoff, meeting Vladimir Putin and apparently putting forward a peace plan which looked like the Russian proposals. Let's listen to President Putin in the last 48 hours saying that he is willing to put aspects of Russia's position in writing, including that it has no plans to attack Europe.
We discussed it with U.S. negotiators before my visit to Alaska. Afterwards, the 28-point list was formed. As I've already said publicly, it was given to us through certain channels. We studied this document. Following that, the U.S.-Ukraine negotiations took place in Geneva. As I understand, they decided that all 28 points should be grouped into 4 separate components. We received all this. In general, we agree that it can be used as a basis for future agreements, but it will be impolite on my part to speak about any final versions, because there are none.
From the Russian perspective, Geoffrey, what do you think are the prospects for Ukraine, and indeed what price do you put on those statements from President Putin that he has no plans to attack Europe further?
Well, I mean, if you look just at the history we've discussed, Russia promised in writing that it would respect the territorial integrity and existing borders of Ukraine in the Budapest Memorandum and subsequently. So, I mean, frankly, you would be forgiven for thinking that those promises aren't worth the paper that they're written on if they're not backed up by some real power on the ground. And that's, I think, where these negotiations really need to focus, is to prevent it. One is to stop the war, and the second is to prevent it from starting again. And starting again would presumably mean renewed Russian aggression. And And so for these negotiations to succeed in the long term, I think what you need is a balance of power where Ukraine can defend itself with the support of Europe and behind that, presumably, a United States backstop. But that's what's going to lead to a lasting peace, because Putin has showed that secure assurances in writing are really worth very little. And the fact that he's willing to write something into the Russian constitution or Russian law, I mean, I wouldn't give that any weight at all if I was Ukraine.
Jeffrey Price, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on the Archive on Sunday.